Well, hello and welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam show, where we try to tell the truth about the Vietnam War and those of us who were involved with it. A lot of myths and misconceptions out there. So our mission to tell the truth. I am your host, Bill Dixon. I was in Vietnam in 67 and 68 during a Tet Offensive. I was in the 1-5 Engineer Group at Long Binh. We're broadcast courtesy of Nissan Communications in their worldwide studios here in Raleigh. If you have any comments, suggestions, or whatever, just send me an email, dixonbill80@yahoo.com. But during the show, I'd like for you to come in sometime to participate in the live show. Comments, dial 919-518-9773. Or even better, come in on Skype. It's Computers 2K Voice. Phone is 919-518-9773. Skype is Computers 2K Voice. So that tells you everything you need how to get in touch with us. Now, this is a tough time of year. I've talked to several veterans recently myself who are with the COVID and everything else going on. There's a lot of depression and feel like they're locked in by themselves and so forth, especially a lot of old veterans right now. So if you are a veteran or you know a veteran or a family member, whatever, check on them and be sure to have this number there for them to call the Veterans Crisis Line. There's someone there trained to talk with you, and sometimes just talking or give you a direction of where you can go to get more help. So 1-800-273-8255, and be sure to press 1. Okay, tonight's show is going to be based on, as you can see right there, World War II from Pearl Harbor to Vietnam. This past Monday was December 7th, Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. And from what I could tell on the news, not many of the news media remembered Pearl Harbor Day because you didn't see them much. That is Pearl Harbor the way it looked now and then, but for that matter. You see the harbor there, it's in Hawaii and then Vietnam. So we're going to talk about how we got from Pearl Harbor to Vietnam in doing the show, tied in. Now, that is not, that piece of paper right there is not turned sideways. Well, actually it is, but that's the way the writing is. A July 15th, 1941 memo to Franklin Delano Roosevelt from Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall summarizes an intercepted Japanese diplomatic message concerning Japan's imminent takeover of Indochina, which was Vietnam, as we know it, from the French Vichy regime. Japan's movement into Indochina would prompt FDR to impose economic sanctions on Japan and ultimately shut off all exports of oil to Japan. They were also got mad with them for attacking China. So the sanctions were out there. Now, as you know, as I'm going to go through this, there's a lot of names and locations that my southern tongue have a hard time saying. So if some of you are much more educated than me, call in and tell me how to pronounce some of these names. If not, just grin and bear my pronunciation. I can't even pronounce pronunciation. This is Secretary of State Cordell Hull with the ambassadors to Japan, NOMA and Special Envoy Caruso, 17th of November, 1941. The ambassadors were given orders to go to the White House to tell President Roosevelt that they were going to be attacked, but they were late getting there, so it was a surprise attack, which ticked everybody off. A December 1st, 1941, remember the Pearl Harbor days of the 7th, a December 1st, 1941 memo from FDR to Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Undersecretary of State Sumner. After learning about a massive Japanese troop buildup in Indochina, President Roosevelt instructs his top diplomats to immediately learn the intentions behind the Japanese government's latest move. FDR discusses the obvious parallels between Japan's actions in the Pacific and Germany's action in Europe. This is Pearl Harbor by air at that time. As you can see, They got all the battleships right there together, dumped together. That's great, except somebody's going to bomb you. If you miss one ship, you get the other one. Pearl Harbor is a U.S. naval base located near the city of Honolulu on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. But you can see the battleship row there. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on a 7 December 1941 Sunday morning around 8 a.m. Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Excuse me. It was a devastating blow to the U.S. Japanese bombers and fighter planes heavily damaged or destroyed more than 20 U.S. Navy ships. 8 of them were the battleships and over 300 airplanes. Luckily, the aircraft carriers were all out to sea, so we didn't get any of them. But that is the Arizona before it gets hit. The right picture is the Arizona as it was going down, and the left picture there is actually Ford Island, which is part of the Pearl Harbor area. There were over 2,400 military and civilians killed and 1,000 wounded during the surprise attack. I used to have a friend, I think he's gone now, but he was a little boy, he's Hawaiian, and he was in Honolulu up in a tree watching the planes came in and just wondering what in the world was going on. This is FDR, and in his speech, the famous speech he made, the 7th of December, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. On December 8th, the American Congress, at the request of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, declared war on the United States. So now we got a real pickle going, because now we're on the war in two fronts. We're fighting in Southeast Asia, and now we're also fighting in Europe. The United States entered World War II 2 years after the war began. The United States virtually fought two wars simultaneously, one against the Japanese in the Pacific and the other against Germany and its allies in Europe. Not many countries could fight two battles going on at one time, especially since we weren't ready for it, but we, American people, got behind it and brought back out, and we outdid everybody as far as tanks and guns and so forth. Japan, I didn't know about this. Japan is somewhat isolated. The nation is made up of 6,500 islands. But in the picture there, you can see it looks like one. During the Great Depression of 1930, the Japanese government felt that the way to solve its demographic and economic problems was to expand into China. In 1937, Japan declared war on China. The United States wanted to put a stop to Japan's expansion and place heavy sanctions on Japan. So you see the sanctions they had on China, and then they turned back around and put more sanctions on after they hit Indochina. Headlines: U.S. and Britain freeze Japanese assets, ore shipments and silk imports halted. Russians still hold as Nazis renew drives. After the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 and the French Indochina in 1940, the United States began to place sanctions by restricting trade with Japan. In 1940, it ceased exporting airplanes, airplane parts, aviation fuel, and machine tools to Japan. And in 1941, it stopped the export of oil. This intensified the Japanese need for rubber from Malaya and oil from the Dutch East Indies. It's all fallen in place. After President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had warned Japan against attacking any other Southeast Asia countries and negotiations with the United States had been unsuccessful, Japan saw no alternative to destroy the main threat to their plans for expanding the war. The immediate purpose of Japan's attack on the United States in 1941 was to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japan saw the United States as a potential hindrance in their plan to conquer Malaya and the Dutch Indies to secure needed resources. So we didn't have the big navy that they had, so they thought maybe they could come in. And actually, some of them wondered why they didn't do the second level of attack that they were supposed to do, because they left some ships there. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and then declares war on the United States. In attacking the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Japan hoped to not only destroy U.S. naval presence in the Pacific, but to also inflict a significant blow to the morale of the United States. Japan reasoned that if the attack was devastating enough, it might discourage the United States from ending the war. And it worked the other way. It ticked us off. Uncle Sam's forces, okay. This is what we did, though, in retaliation. A December 10th, 1941 letter and accompanying map sent to FDR by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover showing the locations of 1,212 Japanese aliens considered to be disloyal or dangerous who were arrested by the Bureau within 48 hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Additional maps gave the locations of the 620 Germans and 98 aliens taken into custody. Now you can see the bottom right-hand picture is one of the camps that we put all the Japanese, anybody that looked like they were Japanese or couldn't prove they weren't Japanese, we put all of them in there and their families and so forth. And as you can see there, a white man's neighborhood, Japs keep moving. Before that, even if you were Japanese and didn't get put into camps, they didn't have a place to stay, and they lost their businesses and their homes and everything. The Japanese Imperial Army invaded Vietnam September 1940. They remained in Vietnam until August 1945, the end of the World War II. The French colonial government and the Japanese signed an accord to allow up to 6,000 Japanese military personnel to be in Vietnam at one time. You can see the Japanese coming to town. They signed an agreement with the French that, just let us have a little bit in, and we'll talk about what happened next. The accord was broken the first day as tens of thousands of Japanese military moved into Hanoi. Less than a week later, the Japanese had routed the French troops and taken over control of Hanoi. Initially, the Japanese forces were careful not to go into South Vietnam, but after Pearl Harbor, they sent 140,000 troops south and soon occupied the South. The Japanese allowed the French colonial government to stay pretty much intact and govern Vietnam under their direction until March 1945. The Japanese did not have the people to run the government and run the country, so they let the French do it, but they had a guy sitting right there telling them, the French, what to do and what they couldn't do and so forth, but French did all the work. The Japanese occupying Vietnam got the United States' attention. In 1940, the U.S. was not in a war with Japan, as Pearl Harbor had not been attacked, but they were trying to stop the Japanese from expanding through Asia. Plus, the U.S. also wanted to protect its imports of raw rubber. That is a rubber tree, and you can see it's got a cut in it and a little bowl right there, and it keeps that sap runs out, and that's what tires come from. Like Michelin tire plantations where those tires, those trees are. It's interesting to see it run out into those cups. But rubber was our big thing that we wanted to protect. In the beginning, the United States supported the French colonial government in Vietnam. When the French started to cave into the demands of the Japanese, the U.S. backed off. After Pearl Harbor, they really backed off. The war in Asia caught the interest of the U.S. and into China. They opened an OSS, which is the Office of Strategic Services Station in southern China, where they supported the Chinese and Vietnam resistance groups. That is some of the Viet Minh being trained, as you see right there. So, early in 1945, the Japanese and French colonial government in Vietnam came to an impasse. The French had been insistent in the rescue of downed American pilots and refused to hand them over to the Japanese. The French were then removed from power in Vietnam by the Japanese. They said that they were dealing with the Americans, so they were going to no longer be in power. The Japanese appointed Emperor Bao Dai to govern and had him to proclaim Vietnam as an independent state and put him in charge under their supervision. Basically, they took the French out and put this emperor in, whose name's going to pop up quite a bit. So he was running the country. The Japanese invasion raised the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh to the forefront of politics in Vietnam. With the shutdown of the French colonial government, the Viet Minh led by Ho Chi Minh benefited greatly. See, the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh were fighting the Japanese, but they were also fighting the French. And when they kind of kicked the French out and so forth, even though they'll put them in jails, Ho Chi Minh had more room to fight and recruit new people. As the Japanese grew weaker on the war front, Ho Chi Minh, you can see in his picture there, and the Viet Minh got more organized, worked on propaganda and recruiting. The Viet Minh started taking control of the Japanese-held remote villages. The Japanese still held the main cities and so forth, but the small remote villages, the Viet Minh came in and worked with the people there. And there was a famine going on, and they helped the people. So that's how they got in good with the small villages and so forth. To cause problems for the Japanese when and wherever possible, the U.S. sought allies in China and Southeast Asia areas. That job was given to the OSS, who had a base located in Chongqing, China. The OSS approached Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh to work with them against the mutual enemy, the Japanese, to establish an intelligence network in Vietnam and assist in the rescue of downed U.S. pilots. For this, the Viet Minh were to be trained and armed by the OSS, and that is the Viet Cong flag, as you see flying there. So we told Ho Chi Minh if he would help us out, that we would train him and give him some arms and so forth and take care of him. This was not the first government association with Ho Chi Minh. In December 1942, the American embassy in China was contacted by the Viet Minh to help secure the release of a Vietnamese prisoner held in Chinese prison for having invalid identification. That prisoner was Ho Chi Minh. And that's one of the books he wrote while he was in prison, The Prison Diary of Ho Chi Minh. Shortly after Ho was released from prison in September of 1943, and he returned to Vietnam to fight for its freedom, and an OSS memo was issued to the fact that the Viet Minh should be used to create problems for the Japanese military in Vietnam. The suggestion was to allude to, if the Allies won the war, then Vietnam would gain its independence. Important to remember that as we go on. The suggestion was to allude that they would have their country back. Now, after the Japanese military had kicked out the French colonial government, the OSS and the Viet Minh discovered that the Japanese did not have enough manpower to defend all of Vietnam. The Viet Minh began to organize themselves in a provisional government in the villages, as we talked about. On March 1945, the Viet Minh rescued a downed American pilot. Ho Chi Minh himself delivered a pilot to U.S. forces in China. Ho was offered money as a reward, but rejected the offer. He asked only to meet General Clarence Chennault, the man that had founded the Flying Tigers, a group of Americans flying and fighting with the Chinese. And now, most of you have probably heard of the Flying Tigers, but that's General Chennault there. Okay. While meeting with Ho, General Chennault asked what he could do for Ho. Ho told the general all he wanted was an autographed picture of the two of them together. The picture and a set of pistols were delivered to Ho Chi Minh. He used the picture as a sign of his support of the Americans. So with the other communists and other groups there in Vietnam, he held up the picture and said, look, this is me with General Chennault, and I got the Americans on my team, so you better fight with me and help me out. May 16, 1945, the OSS sent in its code name Deer Team. That was the Deer Team was the code name of the OSS came in to train and supply the Viet Minh. But the team sat in China for 2 months waiting for the French to give permission for them to deploy into Vietnam. We were still working through the French at that time. 7 members of the Deer Team eventually parachuted into Vietnam in July. Now, all this going on in 1945 gets busy here. So the team got to Vietnam in July. Well, the Deer Team arrived. Ho Chi Minh was nowhere to be found. He was sick and too sick to see them, and he was in a village nearby. But on 3rd of August, the OSS team with their medic, Paul Hogan, went uninvited to the village to see if they could help. In other words, they kept stalling them. But he went into the village. Now, the medic felt that Ho had dengue fever, which is a mosquito-borne disease that occurs in tropical and subtropical areas of the world. A severe form of dengue fever, also called dengue hemorrhagic fever, can cause severe bleeding, a sudden drop in blood pressure, shock, and death. And he also had dysentery and hepatitis. The medic gave Ho some medication and checked on him from time to time, and he got better. Let's go right there and go, what if that medic, how things would have been different? The OS team, dear team, leader Major Thomas reported to OS headquarters that the Viet Minh was a conglomerate of all political parties that stood for liberty and had no political plans beyond that. Oh, was he fooled. Thomas further stated that Ho and the Viet Minh were not communists. His reason was because the villagers did not know what communism or socialism meant, but they didn't understand freedom and liberty, which is what they were promised by the Viet Minh. He also reported that the French would have to go because the Vietnamese hated them more than they hated the Japanese. So even though he was saying after the war was over, that French would have to leave just like the Japanese because the Vietnamese, after all those years of being colonized and badly treated, they wanted them out too. Okay, this is the deer team. You see Ho Chi Minh there with his little chinny hair. In the middle is the OSS Major Thomas. And the guy with the hat and the towel on right there, that is General Jip. And there's some OSS members there and some Viet Minh members there. But that's the deer team who was going to train these guys and also give them the weapons and so forth. So the OSS team had to wait several weeks for supply drops to arrive in early August. Remember early August, when the supplies had arrived, the team began to show the Viet Minh, who were mostly civilians, how to fire the rifles, machine guns, use mortars, grenades, and bazookas. They used U.S. Army field manuals for training. I wonder how well those were helped them out when we were fighting them. The second week in August, while training was in progress, the team radio operator picked up a message that Japan had surrendered after dropping the 2 atomic bombs. After we dropped the 2 atomic bombs on them. The message found out was out over the radio. That was on August 15th. The next day after hearing the radio report on 15th of August, the deer team believed their mission was completed and issued weapons to the Vietnam men and prepared to leave. On August 16th of August, the team accompanied General Jip and his troops to the French provincial capital located in Tha Nguyen, where the Viet Minh attacked both the French and Japanese until the French surrendered on 25th of August. The Japanese then finally realized that Japan had surrendered and accepted a truce. So now we're all the way to August 25th. At this battle, what was going on, Ho and the Viet Minh leadership held a conference that was attended by 30 delegates from Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos, discussed the new leadership of the region. The Japanese had gone into and had control of Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos at the time. Over the next few days, the delegates discussed their concerns. Several of the delegates attempted to take control. When it was all over, Ho Chi Minh was named the leader and they voted on a new flag and a national anthem. By the end of the first week following the Tan Tro Conference, most of the provincial and district capitals north of Hanoi had fallen to the revolutionary forces. When the news of the Japanese surrender reached Hanoi on August 16th, the local Japanese military command turned over its powers to the local Vietnamese authorities. Now, that was where part of the problem came in because they were supposed to turn over the power to the Chinese. But by turning it over to the Vietnamese, it gave Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh a little more face or a little more power. By August 17th, Viet Minh units in the Hanoi suburbs had deposed the local administrations and seized the government seals, symbolizing political authority. That is the national anthem. I'm not going to sit here and read it. Go a little bit to start with. Soldiers of Vietnam, we go forward with the one will to save our fatherland. One heard steps are sounding and so forth. And he cut me off on that one, okay? He didn't like my singing. In Hanoi, self-defense units were set up and armed with guns, knives, and sticks. Not enough weapons. Meanwhile, Viet Minh had led demonstrations broke out inside Hanoi. The following morning, a member of the Viet Minh Municipal Committee announced to a crowd of 200,000 gathered in Ba Dien Square that the general uprising had begun. It was a total chaos there. The French were getting out, the Japanese were getting out. There was not much government going on. Everybody was trying to do everything. So that was a perfect time for the uprising and so forth with the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh sent telegrams throughout Tonkin, which was Vietnam was basically divided up into three areas, Tonkin, An Lan, and Cochin, China. But they all through Tonkin announcing its victory, and local Viet Minh units were able to take over most of the provincial and district capitals without a struggle. In Annam and Cochin, China, however, the communist victory was less assured because the Indo-Chinese Communist Party and those religions had neither the advantage or of long, careful preparation nor an established liberated base area and army, which we now call South Vietnam. The imperial city of Hue fell like Hanoi, with the takeover first of the surrounding areas. Saigon fell on August 25th to the Viet Minh, who organized the 9-member multi-party committee of the South, including 6 members of the Viet Minh, to govern the city. The province south and west of Saigon, however, remained in the hands of the Hoa religion, or Ho religion. Okay. It's pronounced Hoa most places. Ho Chi Minh moved his headquarters to Hanoi shortly after the Viet Minh took over the city. On August 28th, the Viet Minh announced the Provisional Government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV, with Ho as the president and Minister of Foreign Affairs. Vo Nguyen Giap was named Minister of Interior, which was basically the military, and Pham Van Dong, Minister of Finance. In order to broaden support for the new government, several non-communists were also included. I imagine they didn't have a whole lot of say in it. Emperor Bao Dao, you remember him? The Japanese put him in charge. Emperor Bao Dao, whom the communists had forced to abdicate on August 25th, was given the position of High Counselor to the new government. They didn't want to get rid of him because he had too much of his name and gave him power. So they had to give him something to do, so they gave him a title. On September 2nd, 500,000 people gathered in Ba Dien Square to hear Ho read the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. Based on the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. After indicting the French colonial record in Vietnam, he closed with an appeal to victorious allies to recognize the independence of Vietnam. He knew they were meeting and discussing his country, and he wanted to butter them up. September 2nd was the same day that General Douglas MacArthur received the formal Japanese surrender aboard the battleship Missouri. Banners welcome to the Allies, specifically the United States, flew in the city of Ba Dien Square. The OSS contingent in Hanoi photographed the occasion, and Minister of the Interior Giap recognizes U.S. support in a speech. There's the 200,000 people and their new flag talking about how wonderful the United States was. Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence speech started off using some of the American Declaration of Independence narratives. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live and to be happy and free. That's part of the United States Declaration, but is added to it. And then the Declaration of the French Revolution, made in 1791 on the rights of man and citizens, also states that all men are born free with equal rights and must always remain free and have equal rights. Those are undeniable truths, and it goes on with their Declaration of Independence. Also, the same day of Ho's declaration, the second was busy in September. Also, the same day of Ho's Declaration of Independence, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey arrived in Saigon. The colonel was commander of an OSS team in Indochina, codenamed Embankment, which was overseeing intelligence in the Saigon area. As the month wore on in Saigon, the British, free from hostilities with the Japanese, became politically involved. Chaos ensued and civil war raged. Dewey made some comments and so forth, was not politically correct, and the British general told him to get out. Dewey was ordered out of Vietnam by the British, who suspected him of working with the Viet Minh. Before leaving, Dewey wrote a report to the OSS. Cochin China is burning. The French and British are finished here, and we are to clear out of Southeast Asia. Colonel Dewey was an outspoken man who soon angered British Major General Douglas D. Gracie, who eventually ordered Dewey to leave Indochina. On the way to the airport, Dewey, driving a Jeep, refused to stop at a roadblock manned by 3 Vietnamese soldiers. He yelled back at them in French, and they opened fire, killing Dewey instantly. It was later determined that the Viet Minh had fired on Dewey thinking he was French. He would prove to be the first American soldier killed in Vietnam. He also was the first MIA, as his body was never found. But you won't find him on the wall because the wall started much later. We were not officially at war with them at the time. At the Potsdam Conference, July 1945. Now we were already into September. We're talking about in Japan. In Vietnam. Let's go back to the conference in July of 1945. The Allies had agreed that the Chinese would accept the surrender of the Japanese in Indochina north of the 16th parallel. And if you remember that Japanese turned over to the Viet Minh. And the British south of the line. The Vietnamese nationalists, with the help of Chinese troops, seized some of the areas north of Hanoi. The communists gave high priority to avoiding clashes with Chinese troops, which soon numbered 180,000. To prevent such encounters, Ho ordered the Vietnam Liberation Army troops to avoid provoking any incidents with the Chinese and agreed to the Chinese demanding that the communists negotiate with the Vietnamese nationalist parties. Accordingly, in November 1945, now this gets a little complicated with the names and so forth, but it all come together. The provisional government began negotiating with the VNQDD. That was the Vietnam Cu Doc Dan group, was formed at a meeting in Hanoi on December 25th, 1927, with Nguyen Thai Hoc as the party's first leader, and the Vietnam Phuc Quoc Dong Minh Hoa, which was formed with Japanese sponsorship by Vietnamese nationalists, while Vichy France and Japan controlled French Indochina. The Dong Minh Hoa TMH Vietnam Revolutionary League, or Vietnam Coch Minh Dong Minh Ha, boy, what the group names, was created in October of 1942. Its coalition included members of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, Viet Minh, and groups such as the Phuc Quoc, which were pro-Japanese but still nationalists, both of which initially took a hard line in their demands. The communists resisted, however, and the final agreement called for provisional conditions government, coalition government, can't read my own writing, with Ho as president and national leader Nguyen Ha Van as vice president. That was the communists and the different religious and political parties all coming together. Okay. At the same time, the communists were in a far weaker political position in Cochin China, South Vietnam, because they faced competition from the well-organized, economically influential moderate parties based in Saigon and from religious groups in the countryside. Moreover, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, which arrived in early September, was unsympathetic to Vietnamese desires for independence. French troops, released from Japanese prisons and rearmed by the British, provoked incidents and seized control of the city. A general strike called by the Vietnamese led to clashes with the French troops and mob violence in the French sections of the city. Negotiations between the French and the Committee of the South broke down in early October, as French troops began to occupy the towns in the Mekong Delta. The British didn't have to fight their war. They just turned the weapons over to the French and let the French do it. Plagued by clashes with the religious sects, lack of weapons, and a high desertion rate, the troops of the Viet Minh were driven deep into the Delta forests and other inaccessible areas of the region. In early March, however, the threat of the imminent arrival of French troops in the north forced Ho to negotiate a compromise with France. On the terms of the agreement, the French government recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a free state with its own army, legislative body, and financial powers. In return for Hanoi's acceptance of a small French military presence in northern Vietnam and membership in the French Union. So they were going to coexist, more or less. The terms of the accord were generally unpopular with the Vietnamese and were widely viewed as a sellout of the revolution. Ho, however, foresaw grave danger in refusing to compromise while the country was still in a weakened position. Soon after the agreement was signed, some 15,000 French troops arrived in Tonkin. And both the Vietnamese and the French began to question the terms of the accord. They had an agreement, but when the 15,000 French or the French came back in, they started questioning, well, does that mean this and that mean that, and political stuff. Negotiations to implement the agreements began in late spring at Fontainebleau near Paris and dragged on through the summer. Ho signed a temporary agreement, which gave the Vietnamese little more than the promise of a negotiation of a final treaty the following January and return to Vietnam. With their anti-communist agenda, the Chinese and the British allowed the restoration of French colonial rule. Rather than leaving Vietnam in the hands of red bandits, by late 1946, the French had mobilized 50,000 troops in Vietnam and regained control of Saigon. In November, French naval vessels bombarded the northern city of Haiphong, killing 6,000 civilians. And if you can see the picture there, Hanoi and Haiphong is right there on the coast. It's you probably have heard of Haiphong Harbor and so forth. I think a war started along about there. The Viet Minh retaliated by attacking French positions in Haiphong and Hanoi. These attacks were repelled by French artillery and naval guns. By mid-December, the two sides were openly at war. They were not coexisting anymore. During the first Indochina War, which we're talking about, the Viet Minh encountered similar difficulties experienced by other colonial forces. Despite heavily outnumbered the French forces, the Viet Minh were hindered by severe weapon shortages, particular lack of artillery and munitions. Most of the Viet Minh weapons had been freed from retreating Japanese or seized from captured French. By the end of 1946, northern Viet Minh units boasted 60,000 men, but they only armed with 40,000 rifles. In addition, Viet Minh soldiers were largely untrained and had little understanding of military organization and discipline or strategy. That is General Giap and Ho Chi Minh in the picture. Giap recognized the need for strategies that made use of Viet Minh strengths and exploited French weaknesses. One invaluable source of ideas was a 1936 pamphlet called Problems of Strategy in China's Revolutionary War, written by Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong. That's the book. Giap and Ho Chi Minh adapted Mao's strategies to conditions in their own country. It was impossible for the Viet Minh to win large-scale battles against the French. They could not withstand French artillery or match French air support or supply lines. Instead, the Viet Minh sought to avoid decisive battles and withdraw to the countryside, jungles, and mountains. Now, is that sounding familiar? They would not go into a full battle, but they would hide and guerrilla tactics. In remote bases, they planned to train and prepare the Viet Minh soldiers for future campaigns. Meanwhile, Vietnamese cadres were moving around the peasants working to build up political support. The backing of the Vietnamese people was important because they could supply food, information, and cover for the Viet Minh troops. When ready, Viet Minh soldiers would be deployed to launch surprise attacks, ambushes, and raids on weaker French positions while avoiding full-scale battles. The aim was to prolong the war while inflicting casualties on French soldiers and damage to French resources. The intentions were to make the war costly and unpopular back in France. Eventually, French forces would be weakened enough for the Vietnamese to engage them in decisive battle. Sounds familiar. The first 2 years of the war, 1947 and 48, was marked by sporadic fighting. The French Far East Expeditionary Corps was able to quickly capture and control the major cities, while the Vietnamese followed Jip's strategic plan and withdrew into the mountains, somewhat they were doing with the Japanese. In late 1947, the French Far East Expeditionary Corps launched Operation Lay Olea, whichever you pronounce in French, an attempt to destroy the Vietnamese leadership based at Bac Con, north of Hanoi. More than 1,000 French paratroopers were dropped into the area with orders to flush out the Vietnamese hierarchy. Meanwhile, a 15,000-strong French Far East Expeditionary Corps force was positioned to outflank the retreating Vietnamese and rout them into battle. You see the paratroopers coming in. Despite heavy Vietnamese losses, about 9,000 men, most of the soldiers proved to be too elusive. The enemy, according to one French soldier, melted into the jungle. I've heard that before. In early 1949, the French, frustrated by a lack of progress in the war, changed their tactics and began looking for a political solution rather than a military one. Paris began negotiating with the figurehead emperor, Bao Dao. Remember, the Japanese put him in charge when they were couldn't handle it themselves, about forming a government. The new regime was to remain part of the French Union, but would be self-governing, at least in theory. Bao agreed to the plan, and the national capital was moved from Hue to Saigon. This wasn't a self-tactical move because Vietnamese support was much weaker in the South, which contained higher numbers of Vietnamese middle class, Francophiles, Catholics, Confucians, and Buddhists, political liberals, and moderates. While those groups were welcome Vietnamese independence, they harbored fears about communism and refused to support the Vietnamese, viewing them as lower class bandits. Remember a while ago, the red bandits, led by political troublemakers. Bao Dao's new government was encouraged to form a new military force with the Vietnamese National Army. This was done by recruiting new soldiers, but also by co-opting the private armies run by cultists, warlords, and gangsters. Everybody had their own little army. They put them together. The Vietnamese National Army officers were given the same command training by French as French soldiers. Recruits were promised good pay and the opportunity to serve in France. Promises were later broken. By 1952, the NVA had more than 120,000 soldiers and was fighting alongside the French in many anti-Vietnamese campaigns. That was the Vietnam National Army, the South, fighting along with the French in against the Vietnamese. The year 1952 also saw some of the most bitter fighting of the war as the Vietnamese launched a series of advances in the north to restore the supply lines and expel the French. When these attacks were unsuccessful, Ho Chi Minh and Jip decided to move men and supplies to Laos, Vietnam's western neighbor, another French colony, to further stretch French resources. This shift would facilitate the final decisive engagement of the French of the First Indochina War. So it worked out well for them. By mid-1953, the First Indochina War was in its 7th year, and there was no obvious prospect of victory for either side. That sounds familiar. French generals had tried a variety of tactics to destroy the Vietnamese, but to no avail. In France itself, the war had become very unpopular. The French war effort was kept alive by American aid. By the start of 1954, the war had cost the United States $3 billion, of which the United States had contributed more than a third. France's unstable domestic politics also undermined the war effort. During the 7 years of war, there were 16 changes of government and 13 changes of prime minister in the French government. France's unstable causing riots, as you can see the picture there. Riots back home in France. By 1953, Paris was desperately seeking an honorable exit from what seemed an unwinnable war. Unable to corner or destroy the Vietnamese, French commanders planned a series of 45 positions across Tonkin, northern Vietnam. The French could not hope to compete with the Vietnamese in the jungles or the mountains, but a string of bases could be heavily defended and used as strategic or staging points for mobile operations. French strategists did not think the Vietnamese or its leaders would risk attacking bases protected by high terrain artillery and air cover. Even if they did, it would play into French hands. That also sounds very familiar. Okay. Now, this is where the French lost their mind. I'll tell you why in just a minute. The French also hoped to prevent the transit of enemy forces between Vietnam and Laos, where the Vietnamese were resting and resupplying. To halt this flow, French commanders decided to garrison and fortify an old Japanese airstrip at Dien Bien Phu, just a few miles from the Laotian border and 183 miles west of Hanoi. In November 1953, almost 2,000 French paratroopers were dropped into the area. They set to work extending and improving the airstrip to allow more men and supplies to be flown in. With a few weeks, Dien Bien Phu had been transformed into a major military base. Now, if you see the pictures there, those little circles you see there, those are different camps. It was not one place. And I'll tell you what other crazy parts in just a moment. Dien Bien Phu base covered 5 square kilometers and contained 9 separate camps. According to legend, French commander Colonel Christian de Castries named the camps after his 9 mistresses. It also contained a makeshift brothel, which flew in prostitutes from Hanoi to service 15,000 French troops stationed there. Now, if you notice the mountains there, they built their camp down in the valley. Most people know that if you're down in the valley like that, you know, even plumbers understand that it all runs downhill. So you got guys up on those mountains can shoot you and lob stuff at you, and you're kind of trapped. And they did it on purpose. Dien Bien Phu's location offered a tactical advantage and disadvantages. The base sat on the floor of a large valley surrounded by steep mountains and cliffs, some up to a mile high. Apart from one narrow track leading to the local villages, there were no roads or paths into the base. Which means nobody can get in, nobody can get out. An enemy offensive against Dien Bien Phu would require a near impossible trek through the mountainous jungles. The high mountains and accessible forests around the base seemed to be ruled out any chance of an artillery assault. The French thought the location and surrounding terrain made the base unassailable. But the isolation, while a defensive advantage, meant that they could only be resupplied and reinforced from air. The area was also subject to low-lying clouds and dense monsoon rainfall, hampering visibility and flights in and out of the base. So you could only get in there to supply them at certain times. Vietnamese leaders were aware of the French buildup at Dien Bien Phu and aware of the difficulties of mountain attack in that area. General Giap, the Vietnamese military chief, understood the strategic importance of Dien Bien Phu and is aware that the French garrison was vulnerable, surrounded by elevated positions. If an attack could be launched from the mountains around the base, the French could be attacked and starved to surrender. As you can see, they're not good in that picture, but they recruited people from everywhere, tied ropes to the weapons, and carried them uphill, pulled them uphill by ropes, determined to get them up there. It would take a monumental effort for the Vietnamese to even reach the mountaintops around Dien Bien Phu, let alone contend with the heavy artillery. By the start of 1954, Giap had organized around 50,000 Vietnamese troops, almost 1/3 of his entire army, and marched them through the hilltops around Dien Bien Phu. These Vietnamese soldiers were supported by thousands of local peasants. including many women who provide labor, building roads, clearing jungle, and hauling equipment. Among the cargo were several dozen heavy artillery guns obtained by Jip from the Chinese, as well as Soviet-supplied trucks and tons of small arms, munitions, and supplies. All were hauled up the steep mountain slopes by hand. Artillery pieces were pulled apart at the foot of the mountains and reassembled at the top. That was kind of the beginning of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By March 1954, Jip felt secure enough to launch his main offensive on March 13th. His artillery began pounding Camp Beatrice in the base's northern quadrant. Within 12 hours, the camp was destroyed and more than 400 French soldiers were killed, and the airstrip was unusable. Under the cover of darkness, Jip's men moved from the mountains down into the valleys. For 20 days, the French forces withstood massive attacks from the Vietnamese, with both sides incurring heavy losses. That's the French dug in. Jip ordered trenches to be dug at strategic points around the valley, and the French followed suit. They dug trenches. Days of heavy rain flooded the valley floor and filled trenches with mud and water. You see them there digging the trenches and holding off. With planes unable to land because of the weather and the ongoing battle, the French had to be supplied with parachute drops. But the low clouds and poor visibility saw many fall into the hands of the Vietnamese. Sounds familiar. By mid-April, the Vietnamese had lost about 10,000 men. The French about half that number. The rest of the world, deep in the grip of the Cold War, was focused on this struggle between European power and an Asian communist insurgency. There were repeated calls for the military to intervention from the United States in order to save the French at Dien Bien Phu. For a while, this was strongly considered in Washington. American military commanders quickly devised a strategy to save the French base, codenamed Operation Vulture. It involved intensive low-level bombs runs over the valley, and even if necessary, the use of tactical nuclear weapons against the Vietnamese strongholds. President Eisenhower, however, refused to approve this operation without the support and participation of the British. When London refused, operation was shelved. Nobody wanted to be guilty of using nuclear weapons again. By early May, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu was perilously short of men, munitions, food, and medical supplies. On May 7th, the day before the Geneva Conference opened in Switzerland, Jip ordered one final assault. More than 20,000 Vietnamese soldiers swarmed against positions held by around 3,000 able-bodied French troops. By nightfall, the French defenses had been overrun, prompting the French to formally surrender. And you can see the Vietnamese flying their flag there over the revetments of the French. The Vietnamese found themselves more than 11,000 prisoners. More than a third of them were injured or seriously ill. They didn't have food for themselves. These prisoners were forced to march more than 300 kilometers to Vietnamese bases in the northeast. Fatigued, beaten, and malnourished along the way, only half reached the destination alive. Sounds like the Bataan Death March. Of the 11,000 French soldiers stationed in Dien Bien Phu at the start of 1954, fewer than 3,500 would survive. When Dien Bien Phu fell to the Vietnamese on May 7, 1954, after nearly 2 months of bitter fighting, it marked the first time a non-European colonial independence movement, which had evolved from guerrillas to a conventional army, had been able to defeat a modern Western occupier. After the French defeat, France signed the 1954 Geneva Accords, which led to its withdrawal from French Indochina and dividing Vietnam into 17th parallels into North and South Vietnam. Indochina is armistice signed, Vietnam split at 17th parallel. U.S. finds it can't respect a pact. France agreed to withdraw its forces from all of its colonies in French Indochina, while stipulating that Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, with control of the North given to the Viet Minh as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, and the South became the state of Vietnam, nominally under Emperor Bao Dao again, preventing Ho Chi Minh from gaining control of the entire country. Bao Dao keeps popping up. Both North and South Vietnam wanted the same thing, a unified Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh wanted Vietnam a country modeled after other communist countries. Bao wanted the Vietnam modeled after the economics and culture of the West. Even though it has been said that the Accords required a general election to be held, it did not. Neither the North or South agreed to an election. In 1955, Diem pushed Emperor Bao out of South Vietnam, and he became president of the Republic of Vietnam. The Cold War was getting in full swing between the Soviet Union and the United States and their allies. With North Vietnam allied to the Soviets, President Eisenhower pledged full support to the Republic of Vietnam. With the CIA training and materials from the American government, South Vietnam was supposed to be able to confront the Viet Minh and any other group that opposed them. South Vietnamese President Diem gave the Viet Minh their derogatory name, Viet Cong, or Vietnamese Communist. So Diem gave come up with the word Viet Cong. President John Kennedy sent a team in 1961 to see the condition in South Vietnam. The team devised a buildup of American military and economic and technical aid to help fight the communist threat. The United States was very concerned about the domino theory. And you know what happened next? The Second Indochina War, as we know it as the Vietnam War. There were a lot of what ifs in the occurrence that we just talked about. What if that medic hadn't saved Ho Chi Minh? What if Japan had not bombed Pearl Harbor? What ifs? There are a lot of what ifs we've talked about. A lot of similarities between our Second Indochina War, or the Vietnam War as we know it, and the First Indochina War. So as you go about, you can realize that just look back in history, and one thing led to another sometimes. So it's amazing something that happens now, how it can have effects later. By the way, just so you know, I have decided that we're going to take the 23rd of December off. I know a lot of you are going to be on the road going places or getting ready for Christmas. So I know you don't want to miss the show, so I want to make sure that we just cancel it. Last show, we talked about service dogs, who I now have one, and we talked about a group of Vets United. And those of you who sent in contributions, I greatly appreciate your support. They do good work. Also, I want to say Happy Hanukkah to Amnon and all our friends out there. Since we're not going to be here for Christmas, I want to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Our next show will be January 12th. Don't know what it's going to be yet, but I'll put it together. Again, thank you for watching our show. Please tell all your friends about us. And if you want to see the show again, just go right back to www.nissancommunications.com, go to On Demand, check on the LOV show, and pick out the show you want. Because I noticed some in the past that you probably have not seen. It's a good time to go back and see them on that day, rather than do the best of, because they're all best. So on the 23rd, be sure to go in. But you can go in anytime, and I wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah, and look forward to seeing you next year.
And Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah to you too.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.